This is the story of the Battle of Britain. I cannot stress enough that this is the truest, most comprehensive retelling of the story ever. Well, maybe. The Battle of Britain occurred in the summer of 1940. This may come as a surprise to many Americans, who are of the impression that the Second World War began in December 1941, with some obscure naval base in Hawaii being attacked. Britain was a green and pleasant land, in which people drank warm beer, played cricket, and followed the progress of parliamentary bills on the wireless. Germany, meanwhile, was a generally unsporting nation, which proved unable to come to terms with having been soundly thrashed in the First World War. As a strange consequence of this, a great many German men had begun dressing up as Boy Scouts and playing a lot of Wagner. Who knows why, but then there is really no understanding foreigners. During all this kerfuffle, Britain was led by a charismatic old gent with a liking for port and Havana cigars. Germany, on the other hand, was led by an irate little Charlie Chaplin look-alike who did a great deal of shouting. Our man could hold speeches. Proper speeches. Memorable speeches.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
On the other hand, the German chap, well, I say German, I believe he was in fact Austrian, spent most of his time roaring at the sky and waving his arms about. But then, of course, we cannot begin any retelling of the Battle of Britain without touching upon the thorny issue of German engineering. Let's face it, these people could not engineer for toffee. Whereas the British provided sublime designs like the Hurricane and the Spitfire, the Germans sent planes our way that beggared belief. Ground attack planes such as the infamous Stuka dive bomber, or the Messerschmitt 110, appeared to have been designed with the British in mind. For should you be able to shoot the pilot, you would have a second German in the canopy, facing the wrong way, with little to no chance of getting out of the plane once it went into a tailspin. I guess it was an early version of buy one, get one free. The main German fighter plane, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, was of course another turkey. Angular and nasty-looking, it possessed all the grace of a balsa wood model cut into shape by a 4-year-old with a blunt, rusty hacksaw. Tellingly, it was powered by a motor produced by BMW, a company which later went on to discover that it was better suited to making cars. And then there were the German bombers. Having been designed with no thought as to the possibility of someone actually opposing them, their noses were built like panoramic viewing platforms for tourists. All of them, the Junkers 88, the Dornier 117, and foremost among them, the Heinkel 111, were constructed at the nose section like somewhat streamlined glass houses. Imagine the sheer delight of any fighter pilot spotting the opportunity to attack this fragile nose section with the 8 Browning machine guns each British fighter plane had installed in its wings. Consider for a moment, if you will, that once the bullets start hitting the lavish glass canopy, not only the bullets, but so too thousands of shards of glass would now be heading at high velocity toward both the German pilot and co-pilot. So whether torn apart by British machine guns, or lacerated beyond recognition by German glassware, the outlook for the crew in the cockpit of a German bomber over Britain was none too promising. But when we speak of the German Air Ministry's love of turning a plane into a flying greenhouse in which to grow tomatoes, nothing quite compares to the Focke-Wulf 189. Feast your eyes on this cathedral to the glassmaker's art, and ask yourself just how happy you might be having to fly a reconnaissance mission over the English Channel in this glorified flying crystal vase. Yet should you still remain unconvinced as to the German inability to produce any sensible design with which to beset the United Kingdom, then I invite you to take a look at a rival design to the Focke-Wulf 189, which was the Blohm & Voss BV 141. Now if you can look at this abomination and still conclude that German aircraft designers were not drunk for half the time that they were at work at the office, then you are beyond help. The Germans had flung themselves into war as clearly the best prepared nation at the time. Everyone else in Europe being too busy getting on with life, nobody was quite ready when the Germans announced that the First World War had merely been a practice attempt, and they demanded a do-over. Poland, Belgium and France were overcome soon enough. But Britain, in a rather uncanny manoeuvre, managed to scurry her army out of the way back to Blighty at Dunkirk. Thus, still having an intact army, albeit one which left most of its equipment back in France, Britain was still in a position to resist. This sort of thing irked Mr. Hitler. So he now decided this was the time to knock Britain out of the war. Hence Operation Sea Lion was commissioned. It was to be another shining example of exacting German efficiency. But there were a few problems. Britain's main battle fleet, anchored up at Scapa Flow, would be able to cause an awful lot of trouble for any would-be invaders trying to cross the English Channel. Frankly, it would have made matchwood out of them. Also, taking an army to Britain and keeping it supplied as it fought its way inland would be a massive operation. Any even temporary failure by German cross-channel shipping, and Germany could wave goodbye to any army which he had landed across the Channel. Thus one needed air superiority. So far so good for the Germans. They were quite good at air superiority. Or so they thought. Recent German military experience had led her leadership to be dreadfully overconfident. Having sent her Luftwaffe to Spain to get in a little bombing practice during the Spanish Civil War, Germany next went on to bomb Poland and then France with very little airborne opposition. I mean, if these are your planes, then you might be out of luck when you come up against a bunch of Messerschmitts. Now, however, things were to change. No longer up against mere foreigners, now these strutting Luftwaffe Johnnies faced proper British personnel in Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. Moreover, the crafty British had cheated. Suspecting that things might not go as intended in France, Britain had held back her ace card. The Germans had so far encountered the Hawker Hurricane in the skies over France, but knew nothing about the Spitfire. As it proved, dear old Germany was in for a bit of a surprise. The Luftwaffe, though, went into battle with reasonable talent in its fighter plane cockpits. Men such as Herbert Ihlefeld, Werner Mölders, a man with an uncanny resemblance to Matt Damon called Helmut Wick, and Walter Oesau. Some of the best swagger, though, came from the leading German fighter ace, Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, who was the only pilot known to have an ashtray installed in his cockpit, so he could continue smoking his cigars when on mission. But even such admirable eccentricity could not compete with the likes of squadron leader Douglas Bader. Please take a look at this picture. Now I know many of you will notice these two chaps linking arms, and will immediately conclude that there must be something going on here. But a little information often goes a long way. Having crashed in 1931, Bader had lost both his legs, but was back with the RAF once things kicked off again in 1939, now simply equipped with a pair of tin legs. Hence his leaning on someone here for support. Faced with that sort of determination, honestly, were the Germans ever going to get anywhere? And Douglas Bader, famous though he no doubt became, was not even one of the RAF's top aces of the Battle of Britain. For such were the names of Eric Locke, James Lacey, Archie McKellar, Josef František, or Colin Gray. The presence of the name Josef František is a hint at one of the secret weapons of the RAF. For as Germany had gone around Europe annoying everyone, quite a few people felt the need to get even with her. Josef František was such a man. He may have been Czech, but he flew for the RAF Polish 303 fighter squadron. This squadron turned out to be the most successful RAF squadron of the Battle of Britain. But then there are some, myself included, who don't really like to count them among the RAF aces, simply because theirs was an altogether different quarrel. Whereas Britain and Germany were fighting over the destiny of Europe and the free world, the Czechs and the Poles had a much more long-standing, bitter rivalry with the Germans over an ancestral feud about which one of their peoples had actually invented sauerkraut. This lent the contest of arms between 303 Squadron and the Luftwaffe a much more visceral, less sporting nature, and thus it doesn't really compare with the more traditional warfare the RAF were conducting. But let us cast a brief eye on the respective Air Force commanders, shall we, to give ourselves an idea of the quality of leadership the two forces enjoyed. On one side we had quiet, gentlemanly Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, competent, efficient, and thorough. On the other side we had Hermann Göring, an obese loudmouth in fancy dress with an opiate addiction, but a loudmouth who shared with his Führer the ability to get angry and start shouting at the drop of a hat. At first, Göring had plenty of reasons to smile, prance about in his freshly tailored uniforms, and feel important. I refer to Göring's uniforms because he was well known for the ridiculously flamboyant regalia with which his tailors sought to contain his ever-increasing girth. Göring's tailors were having to struggle ever more desperately, but as far as the Luftwaffe were concerned, everything appeared to be going well. Being part of the war machine to a maniacal dictator, it goes without saying that the Luftwaffe was a massive operation, with thousands of aircraft, all ready to strike at Britain, who had only a few hundred aircraft with which to defend herself. On paper, Germany had as good as won. Britain, however, had a few surprises in store for the proponents of the self-appointed master race. Britain's foremost secret weapons were her technical boffins, the countless inventors and tinkerers who provided no end of genius. R.J. Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, Sidney Cam, who did so for the Hurricane, the brilliant engineer Barnes Wallis, with his geodetic Wellington bomber and his bouncing bomb. And thanks to the team of Robert Watson Watt and a particularly dedicated Arnold Wilkins, Britain had created herself the so-called Chain Home, a chain of radar stations that provided the world's first early warning system for incoming aircraft. Unaware of the full significance of what these radio masts along the English coast represented, the Germans had no idea what they were heading into. Had in Poland and France defending planes taken off in the faint hope of finding some enemy aircraft to take on, in Britain they would be sent right into the path of oncoming German traffic. Britain may only have had a few hundred aircraft, but she could use them with terrifying efficiency. The days of flying your bomber to its target and arriving without the knowledge of your enemy were over. Except the poor old Germans were not yet aware of that. Realizing that the radar stations were some sort of warning system, the Germans did launch some attacks upon them. And they believed they had the ideal weapon for these pinpoint attacks, the Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka had done very well in Poland and France. When I say the plane did well, the pilots must have hated it. For psychological effect, the plane had air-driven sirens mounted in its landing gear. These would wail when the Stuka went into a dive. Very effective in terrifying anyone on the ground, no doubt. But the sirens could not be turned off. So the two-man crew needed to endure the racket for the entire journey to and from the target. Sure, the sirens did not howl as much as they did in a dive, but they were said to be stupefyingly annoying. I suspect headache tablets must have been in high demand among Stuka crews. But now that this cumbersome, whining dive bomber was up against more advanced fighters in Britain, it stood no chance. The British, of course, prioritised the defence of their radar stations. The Stukas were torn to pieces. German High Command had plans on conquering the world. The Stuka was integral to these plans. Yet if the Luftwaffe continued to lose Stukas at the present rate, it would very soon not have any Stukas left. So the dive bombers were withdrawn to staunch the bleeding. No doubt the consumption of aspirin tablets among the Luftwaffe pilots must have dropped markedly. But without the dive bombers, Germany had nothing with which to take on the radar stations. Not realizing the importance of the stations in the first place, the Germans just left them be. The radar stations may have been saved, but the airfields took a hammering. German bomber squadrons kept battering them. If the British could not get their aircraft off the ground due to crater-riddled runways, then Germany would win. That said, the Germans were already being hit hard. Baffled by the British radar warning system, the Teutonic pilots found that the British chaps in their Hurricanes and Spitfires always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Worse still for the Germans were the British fighter planes themselves. Of the two standard British fighters, the Spitfire was the thoroughbred, outclassing the Hurricane. But the Hurricane itself was armed with the same 8 Browning machine guns and was able to outturn a Messerschmitt in a dogfight. This provided somewhat of a challenge for the German fighter pilots. But for German bomber crews, all that was left for them to do when spotting an oncoming British fighter squadron was to pray. Which was of course next to useless, as their prayers were in German, whereas God speaks English, as we all know. In short, the Germans had their hands full with these British machines. To top it off, the British pilots were maybe the best trained in Europe. Again, something that caused Mr. Goering considerable headaches. Once he became aware of the problems, Goering is said to have uttered, "We had forgotten the English fought best with their backs to the wall." The fighting continued and remained a closely matched affair, with the Germans seeking to achieve with quantity what they could not with quality. Still they continued to bleed ever more planes and crews. Then, on the 24th of August 1940, a German bomber squadron got lost in the dark and dropped bombs on London. Churchill, whether angered by an attack on a purely civilian target, or, more likely, spotting the chance to poke the bear with a stick, retaliated. He sent forth some Wellington bombers to drop bombs on Berlin. The reaction was not long in coming. Hitler fulminated, spewing hatred and rage at the rate of knots. The world's most fragile ego had been poked, and now he was to go completely overboard and to exact his vengeance. In short, it was the reaction of a 5-year-old boy who'd just been beaten at Monopoly and who insisted the other side had been cheating. The German bombers were at once told to forget about airfields and other places of strategic interest and instead to hit towns and cities. The change of focus by the Germans proved a turning point. If they were already straining with the RAF, the pressure on the airfields was now lessened. Instead, the Teutons were now bombing British cities, which, although looking spectacular on newsreels, was of little strategic use. This image became quite famous, as it shows St. Paul's wreathed by smoke during an attack on London. Of course, many would point out that the cathedral would have been used as an orientation landmark by the Luftwaffe, and the prominent spot will no doubt have been a target. However, the fact that they could not hit something the size of a cathedral shows just how haphazard German bombing was in practice. They seemed to hit everything around it, just not the target itself. Close, Fritz, but no cigar. The RAF, meanwhile, was getting ever smarter at how to deal with the countless Jerrys everlastingly flying towards them in relentless waves. They were by now well practiced at intercepting the attackers and were only getting better at it. German losses were beginning to mount and mount. So much so, German High Command was beginning to grow worried. They had never encountered this. They were used to winning. There was something wrong with this enemy. He seemed not to realize that he was supposed to lose. Something needed to be done. One famous exchange on the German side is recorded by history. When Hermann Göring was seeking to soft-soap his squadron leaders once more, he told them he had the facilities of the whole German Reich at his disposal. They could have whatever they wanted. They had but to name it. What did they want? Our character with a cockpit ashtray and cigars, Adolf Galland, simply replied he'd like a squadron of Spitfires, thank you very much. Hermann Göring's reaction to this was sadly not recorded by history. But what Galland was trying to get across to the corpulent man in the outrageously flamboyant uniform was that the Spitfires and Hurricanes were beginning to get the better of them. Worse for the Germans, they were increasing in numbers. The sheer menace of Spitfires and Hurricanes was becoming too much with which to contend. Losses were escalating. Of yet more concern for Göring was that Germany had other plans afoot. one wanted to invade Russia the following year. Plans were already being drawn up. This was Herr Hitler's grand vision. In fact, he'd written a book about it. Quite a well-known book, in fact. I'm told it still sells rather well in the Middle East, which is a bit of a worry. Anyhow, Göring's problem was that this plan on Russia required airplanes. A great many airplanes. Airplanes the British were now perforating at an industrial rate in the skies over England. And yet the situation was clear. The Messerschmitts might lord it over all other air forces in Europe, but they could make no headway against the Spitfires. Meanwhile, the Hurricanes were tearing chunks out of the German flying glasshouses. It was turning into carnage. In fact, the British were running out of space to put the wreckage of German aircraft. The Stukas had already been withdrawn early in the Battle of Britain to save them for Russia. Now the situation became ever more pressing when it came to the rest of the Luftwaffe. Britain had too good a pilots and too good a planes. Germany needed to stop, or else she'd simply have no Luftwaffe left. Somehow someone managed to impress this on Herr Hitler. No doubt he will have screamed and shouted, blaming God, the weather, and that week's horoscope or some other thing, rather than himself. But in the end the command was given. The Luftwaffe was recalled, for its own good. And much like Napoleon, Hitler, having assembled a large army ready to invade Britain, needed to concede that he simply could not devise a way of crossing that narrow stretch of water that is the English Channel, and instead sent his army eastward. Incidentally, the result of that eastward move proved much the same as it had done for Mr. Bonaparte. The rest of the war, one might say, did not go too well for the German side. It lost a significant amount of manpower in a snowdrift or two outside Moscow, and again in or around some place called Stalingrad. Eventually, after some prodding by the Japanese, the Americans finally woke up to the fact that they once more had overslept when it came to the beginning of a world war. Germany finally found that bombing cities was not that great an idea after all, not least when she found herself at the receiving end of such things. Mr. Hitler appears to have remained angry and defiant to the end. Most likely because he realised, hunkered down in his bunker under Berlin, that on losing the war, no one ever again would see it necessary to lie about how handsome he looked in a pair of lederhosen. Thus, disappointed by a heartless world, Mr. Hitler performed the world's most belated suicide in history. One feels he could have done us all a favour and blown his brains out when his painting career went awry. Ah well, better late than never. As for Mr. Göring, the flamboyant, rotund air marshal, who was good at shouting and who oversaw the debacle that was Germany's attempt on Britain, whatever happened to him? Oh yes, I remember now. Not cutting quite such a dash there, I see. The final word of the Battle of Britain was had by no lesser than Winston Churchill, once he had recovered from choking on his breakfast glass of port, on having been presented the bill for the aircraft fuel at the end of the battle. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he is said to have muttered,
"Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few."